This meeting is being recorded.
So welcome back, everyone, to the third session of the Essence of History seminar series. It's my pleasure and absolute privilege today to introduce Professor David Carr. David received his PhD from Yale University in 1966. He's taught at Yale, the University of Ottawa, and since 1991 at Emory University, where he was department chair and is now Charles Howard Candler Professor Emeritus. He is currently adjunct professor of philosophy at the New School for Social Research in New York City. His areas of research are 20th century phenomenology, especially Edmund Husserl, the theory of historical narrative, and the philosophy of history. He is the author of Phenomenology and the Problem of History in 1974, which was reissued in 2009, Time, Narrative and History in 1986, Interpreting Husserl in 1987, The Paradox of Subjectivity in 1999, Experience in History in 2014, and most recently, Historical Experience in 2021. It's very difficult to overstate the significance of Professor Carr's immense contributions to philosophy over the past 50 years, particularly in the fields of phenomenology and the philosophy of history. So it's a tremendous honor to have him here today. And now I'll hand over to David for his paper, The Varieties of Historical Experience. David.
Thanks very much, Aaron, and for that kind introduction, and thanks for inviting me to join this series. My title, as you'll recognize, is inspired by William James' collection of lectures published in 1902, called The Varieties of Religious Experience. Though it's hard to appreciate this in retrospect, James' book ushered in a whole new approach to the philosophy of religion. This had been dominated by metaphysical and epistemological questions. Does God exist? What is the nature of God, and how does he relate to his creation? How do we know God? How do we know that he exists? How do we know his nature? On the human side, the emphasis was on reason and faith, not experience. James' focus on religious experience, of course, was not completely without precedent. German reformers emphasized inwardness and emotion, foreshadowing the development of German Romanticism and New England Transcendentalism. Religious mysticism, a source of great fascination for James, had a long history in the West. But while these strains animated the practice of religion, they did not figure, for the most part, in the philosophical reflection on religion. James thought that the study of religious experience was essential to the understanding of religion, notwithstanding its great variety. This topic is relevant to the present occasion because the philosophy's history, too, has been largely dominated by metaphysical and epistemological questions, and I think it can benefit by a turn to experience. Human history was not even taken very seriously as a topic for a philosophical reflection until the 18th century, when it was animated, of course, by the idea of progress. The idea then was that the course of historical events displays an advance towards some goal or culmination. This view was propounded, though in different ways, by two of the best known thinkers of the 19th century, Hegel and Marx. At the same time, history was emerging as an academic discipline in the European universities, casting off its traditional role as a literary genre, providing moral edification. Now the emphasis was on knowing the past as it really was, as Ranke famously said, by developing critical methods for interpreting documentary and other evidence. This led to lively debates in the later 19th century about historical knowledge. And here the focus is on difference between explanation and understanding, and on different methods of interpretation. These debates were then revived in Britain and North America in mid-20th century analytic philosophy. So how would the philosophy of history benefit from a turn to experience, and what would such a turn be like? At first glance, such a turn might seem unpromising at best. The term experience has played an important role in modern Western philosophy, but it's not always meant the same thing. Even in British empiricism, where the term first came to prominence, experience acquired two very different meanings. For Locke, it meant a direct and unmediated encounter, an imprint on the blank white paper that constituted the human mind. For Hume, experience was repeated and accumulated encounter with something over a period of time that led to habits and expectations. A similar difference of meaning can be found in Kant's and Hegel's use of the same German term, Erfahrung. We find this difference in our ordinary language. I know the taste of a strawberry by direct experience. But if we say, she's an experienced mechanic, we think of long practice, trial and error, and the acquisition of skills. By the time James gave his lectures, a few more meanings had accumulated, and the Germans had tried to clear up the confusion by inventing a new term, Erlebnis. It didn't help. To make matters worse, with respect to history, there's one thing that unifies the concept of experience in spite of its great diversity. It seems confined to the present. It occurs in the present. It opens us to the present. It is of the present. We distinguish it from memory and expectation, which relate us to the past and the future, respectively. History, in our language and several others, usually means one, what happened, that is past events, or two, our knowledge of past events. We can't experience past events, they're gone. And whatever we know of them must come from other sources: memory, testimony, physical traces. As a consequence, history seems to count as something we know or know about, rather than something we experience. We learn about it in school. We read about it in books. Experience seems out of place. Nevertheless, I want to argue that there is such a thing as historical experience, and that it lies at the heart of what we know about history and of why it is important to us. The idea of what I mean by historical experience can be found in current and recent events. The coronavirus pandemic and the widespread protests against racial injustice superimposed upon it, and the war in Ukraine, are described as events of historic proportions. Yet these events are occurring in the present. As we live through these events, what is the nature of our experience of them, and what makes them historical? In earlier writings, I wrote about the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 and about 9/11, that is what we call the terrorist attacks on New York and Washington in 2001, as examples of experienced history. Like millions of others, I lived through these events as they were happening, thanks to television, of course. I argued that these events differed from other events we experienced precisely by being experienced as historical. Several things were involved. First, an established order is upended. Not just any order, but the historical order, a large-scale historical framework. In this case, respectively, the Cold War and the post-Cold War US hegemony. This shows that our experience of history involved in such frameworks usually not noticed until they're upended. Suddenly, the future of these frameworks is uncertain. What comes next? Our experience is that nothing will be the same again. Consequently, each of these events is experienced as a turning point as it's happening, even though we don't know toward what. Mostly turning points are recognized only retrospectively. For example, the Battle of Stalingrad was the turning point of the war on the Eastern Front. That's something we couldn't be known while it was going on. Here we experience an event as a turning point, even while it's happening. Of course, we may be wrong. Maybe everything will just return to normal and go on as before. But that's not the point. This is about how we experience it. It shows that frameworks, what I'm calling historical frameworks, involve future projections. And perhaps most important, the experience of history in these cases is not just my experience, it's our experience. Each of these events may or may not have impinged on my private life in a quite personal way that differs from that of anybody else. But what counts here is that in a certain way, my experience of these events is our experience. These events are collective in their impact, but the very experience of them is also collective. Now, I want to argue that our experience now of the overwhelming events of our time, that of the extraordinary confluence of pandemic, protest, and war, is an experience of history in much the same way. There are many similarities between pandemic, protest, war, and the events I mentioned before. Large-scale historical frameworks are upended. We seem to be situated at a turning point without knowing the outcome. We know that nothing will be the same, but we don't know how. And again, these events are events that we live through, even though they may affect each of us very differently. Now, the frameworks of these two earlier examples, pandemic and protests, are political. Let's look at the pandemic first. This is a different framework involving person's bodily health and sickness, life and death, social relations, and economic life. Of course, the other two were matters of life and death. The Cold War was constantly overshadowed by the threat of nuclear annihilation and spawned numerous border wars, such as Vietnam. On 9/11, lots of people lost their lives. For all we know, or for all we knew at that time, this was just the beginning of hostilities. But it was a kind of death we were familiar with: bombs, terrorist attacks. In the case of the pandemic, we are familiar with sickness, death from sickness, even infection, but not with such widespread sickness invisibly spread. Every other person may be dangerous to my health, even a threat to my life. So the framework involved here is the deep structure of social life and interaction, conversing, shaking hands, touching, standing, walking, collecting into groups and crowds. Each of these activities is now tinged with danger. The way we do these things is so familiar and unquestioned that we didn't even notice it until it's disrupted. It is very much a bodily and motile framework, but it's a framework nonetheless, and as such, it extends into the future. Now it must be disrupted, or so we are told, if we want to defeat the virus and stay well. The economic disruption reveals how much of our economic life depends on these bodily interactions. They are required for getting food, clothing, entertainment. Take those interactions away, and a lot of economic activity goes with them. For the dwellers in large cities around the world, experience of this moment in time involved the eerie emptiness of the streets, the absence of crowds, the quiet that comes with the disappearance of cars and trucks. But is this really historical? We think of history as involving the political, but it relates to the social world as well. And the worldwide scope of the pandemic places it on a grand scale that approaches that of natural history. And indeed, it is a matter of natural history, but not only that. It's nature encroaching on the bodily and social framework we've been talking about. The biological is attacking the social. And of course, eventually it becomes political as people turn to their governments to address the pandemic. In making my case for historical experience, I argued for different levels of temporality, following suggestions by Claude Lévi-Strauss and Reinhard Koselleck. We can speak of individual and historical temporality. Individual life events belong on one plane, historical on another. As we saw, the fall of the Berlin Wall and 9/11 may be events in my personal life, but each of us realizes in experiencing these events that they also belong to a different plane. The Berlin Wall with other events in the Cold War. 9/11 with the history of the US versus terrorism. This is just another way of saying that these events are not my private affair, but affect everybody. Everybody in quotes, because I don't mean literally everybody. So that's the way we think of them and experience them. Maybe you could say the same for the pandemic, but the connection between personal and social seems much more intimate. Pandemic affects the way I walk, relate spatially to other people, cover my face, etc. Each of these are not just about me, but are reflected in others around me and how they behave toward others and toward me. An element of solidarity is also engendered. We're all in this together is a slogan that is often invoked. But how difficult it is to think of, indeed enact, solidarity without bodily standing together. As the pandemic was still on the rise, outrage erupted over the police killing of George Floyd, on top of many other such killings in recent times. The result was what the New York Times called the largest protest in US history. Indeed, protests against or prompted by the events in the US took place in many cities around the world. The protests were similar to each other, to other such public outrages throughout history. Street demonstrations, some violence, some law breaking, clashes with the police, and above all, largely peaceful marches by people shouting slogans and carrying signs repeated daily for weeks. Here, the perceived enemy, racial oppression, is met in the usual way, standing, marching together. It was obvious right away that this conflicted with the response we were supposed to take in order to defeat the other end, coronavirus. Many demonstrators tried to compromise by wearing face masks and practicing social distancing, but it was evident that many had made the tacit or explicit decision that demonstrations were so important that people needed to risk their health or at the limit even their lives to participate. People who live in cities, even if they did not participate, felt the crowds swirling around them and heard their calls for reform. The experience of popular upheaval, the expression of public outrage in the form of street manifestations directed against government, against the police, all this is nothing new in history. We know that in the past, the outcome of such upheavals has varied considerably. From the overthrow of a government, one extreme, revolution, to the return to the status quo ante, at the other, where nothing changes. But this is what gives the flavor of historical experience to the involvement of the individual while it is going on. Each of these two cataclysmic, large-scale events place the future in doubt, the future of public health and the economy, the future of racism and its effects in society. But the past is also involved. Pandemics have devastated human societies before, though not within living memory of anyone today, and the present crisis takes place in that history. Protests against racial injustice have their background in the long struggle for civil rights and ultimately in slavery itself. Every experience of street demonstrations, every shudder of fear over the spread of the disease has its background in these histories. As the effects of the pandemic waned and protests around social justice subsided, our beleaguered present was shocked to its core by a third historical event. In a very short time, something that was long unthinkable became thinkable, then probable, then actual. War in Europe. War, of course, is nothing new, but war in the heart of Europe, which had been at peace for almost 80 years, involving one of the world's nuclear powers, with the potential for involving another nuclear power, became a war of truly historic proportions. When Russia invaded Ukraine and unleashed lethal destruction on the very doorsteps of NATO, talk of World War III was in the air. Even the US president used that phrase. The threat of a nuclear war between Russia and the West, which many of us, some of us, remember vividly from the days of the Cold War, seemed upon us again. Once again, we seemed to be at a turning point without knowing where we were turning. Now, what do these examples show? I do not mean to suggest that it's only in these extreme cases that we experience history. I think we've been experiencing a lot of history lately, and of course, what happens that they make it explicit, they bring it to mind, they claim our attention. But to my mind, they reveal a dimension of our experience that is always there, even when we don't notice it. To be sure, the sense of a turning point, that feeling of standing at a hinge in time without knowing what will ensue, is not always present. In its absence, the large-scale framework or frameworks of history retreat into the background and maintain the status of the taken for granted. But these frameworks are always there. I would argue that they are experienced not merely in certain domains, such as that of our political experience, allegiance, and participation, but that they form an aspect of all their experiences. In the formation of the historical world and the human sciences, Willem Dilthey writes, quote, "From the distribution of trees in a park, the arrangement of houses on a street, the handy tool of the artisan, the sentence handed down in a courthouse, we are surrounded at every moment by what has developed historically. History is not something separated from life or remote from the present." End quote. Here Dilthey is commenting on what he calls historicity, Geschichtlichkeit. In the same work, he says, quote, "We are historical beings before being observers of history," end quote. When Dilthey says we are historical beings, he is referring to something like what I'm calling historical experience. He's claiming here that even our experience of ordinary things and events recognizes them, at least implicitly, as belonging to the plane of history. Dilthey's references to parks, streets, and houses reminds us that our built environment is the locus of our daily experience of history. These are not just objects that we see, but sites of practical engagement. Houses are places of dwelling. Streets are paths that guide us and take us where we want to go. Parks offer respite and repose along the way. And they do this, not just for me, but for others, and have done so in many cases long before me. Shared spaces are places of history. In Memory, History, Forgetting, in a section where he connects inhabited space and historical time, Paul Ricoeur writes, quote, "It is on the scale of urbanism that we best catch sight of the work of time in space. A city brings together in the same space different ages, offering to our gaze a sedimented history of tastes and cultural forms. A city gives itself as both to be seen and to be read. In it, narrated time and inhabited space are more closely associated than they are in an isolated building. The city also gives rise to more complex passions than does the house, inasmuch as it offers a place for displacement, gathering, and taking a distance. There we may feel astray, rootless, lost, while its public spaces, its named spaces, invite commemoration and ritualized gatherings." End of quote. This passage captures several aspects of urban life that are relevant to this topic. In the cityscape, we are surrounded by testimonies of earlier architectural styles and forms, layered on top of one another, or rather inserted among each other. Older buildings, when they were first built, offered very different views to those who looked out their windows compared to those who look through them today. When he says that, quote, "we may feel astray, rootless, lost," Ricoeur seems to refer to the occasional disparity between the individual life and that of the surrounding city. As we saw, there are different levels of temporality, those of individual life and those of historical change. Between these two, there may be others, such as the life of my family. As we suggested earlier, the experience of empty streets of the city on lockdown is the experience of a jarring historical moment in the life of the city. But the experience of the normal city, with all its hustle, bustle, and noise, is no less an experience of history. Ricoeur also mentions the narrated time of the city. The development of the city can be read in the story of its architectural unfolding. Just as each of us has a life story that changes as we age, so the city and the society have a history in which the individual participates through the kind of historical experience that I'm describing. We experience history by virtue of our participation in communities that predate and outlive our individual lives. Thanks to this participation, history enters directly into our lived experience and becomes part of our identity. It gives us access to a past, a tradition, and a temporal span that is not so much something we know about as something that is part of us. This is the primary sense in which we are, in Dilthey's words, historical beings before we are observers of history. The connection between narrative and historical time is one that has been explored in depth by Ricoeur and other theorists of history. But narrativist theories of history, as they developed in the late 20th century, were often seen to count against the idea of historical experience that I'm urging here. The reason, I think, is their emphasis on the role of retrospection in history. Beginning with the important work of Arthur Danto and continuing in the work of Louis Mink, Hayden White, and certain structuralists, philosophers take note of the fact that the discipline of history derives its claim to truth from the retrospective view. We already mentioned the dependence of the idea of turning point, the Battle of Stalingrad, on our later knowledge of how things turned out. According to this view, in historical narrative, the historian draws on literary structures properly at home in fiction, beginning, middle, end, for example, and applies them retrospectively to the flow of events in order to make sense of them. But historical events on this view do not have narrative structure, and any application to them of historical narrative form necessarily falsifies them in the interests of making sense. Narrative history thus distorts its object by its very nature. In my view, this theory separates narrative form from experienced events in a way that falsifies both. It seems to be inspired by Stendhal's character Fabrice in La Chartreuse de Parme, who wants to fight with Napoleon, goes in search of a battle, wanders onto the field at Waterloo, and is disappointed when all he sees are people riding their horses in all directions and shooting singly at random. This view leads to the absurd conclusion that since the only way of making sense of things is through retrospective narration, ordinary experience and action, lacking this perspective, must be senseless and formless. So the soldiers in battle at Waterloo or Stalingrad, on this view, are engaged in chaotic and senseless activities, waiting on later historians to determine that they were fighting a battle. But experience has its own structure. The judgment of later historians may be different from that of the participant. It may even be better in some cases. It's the historian, after all, who can see the battle as a turning point in light of later events. But the historian is not imposing structured order on formless chaos. Instead, the historian interrogates critically an order that is already there in the action and experience of historical subjects. Historical retrospection often trades in unintended consequences. Columbus had no idea that he was discovering America. Martin Luther did not desire or expect to cause a split in the Western Church. The historian has the advantage of hindsight, but behind every unintended consequence lie the intended consequences of the historical agent. Part of the historian's work is recovering what agents thought they were doing, which means recovering the historical experience of the agent. There's a close connection, I would argue, between the beginning, middle, end structure of narrative and the means end structure of action. The latter is, of course, teleological structure in which the means end in view lends order and significance to the steps leading up to it. Teleology is of the essence of human action and experience. I would add that the subject of such action and experience is often not singular, but a plural subject. Teleology and plurality or community are key elements in the experience of history. It is also found in the example I used earlier of the experience of being situated at a turning point without knowing toward what we are turning. The teleological structure is all the more striking when a key element of it goes missing. The teleological structure of experience is at the origin, it seems to me, of certain attempts by philosophers to grasp the large-scale contours of history. The idea of historical progress is a corollary. The so-called speculative philosophy of history inspired by Hegel and Marx, and more recently, if briefly, resurrected by Fukuyama, has been mostly rejected by theorists of history, and rightly so. But inspired by Kant's critique of metaphysical speculation, I think it's important to show that historical speculation is not simply mistaken or simply unsubstantiated, but has its origin in certain elements of human experience, extended beyond their proper limits. Kant speaks of a transcendental illusion and argues that it lies so deep that attempts to eradicate it will be more than difficult. Now I come to the topic of varieties. One of the things that William James wanted to convey with his title in his lectures is that religion is not one thing. It comes in many forms of experience to different people in different circumstances. We found something similar in the varieties of historical experience that we've considered here. We began by looking at recent convulsive upheavals that reveal themselves as historical experiences: pandemic, protest, and war. But each is historical in its own way. The pandemic is deeply bodily, not only in threat and widespread reality of illness and death, but also in the social and medical response that affects our social embodiment and interpersonal reactions. Social protest is also embodied, but in a different and familiar way: marches, rallies, demonstrations. And if the goal of the pandemic response was to defeat the virus, the goal of protests is political reform. In the case of the Ukraine war, we moved to the geopolitical arena. If the fall of Berlin Wall was experienced as the end of the Cold War, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is now seen as its revival, except it's not cold anymore. It takes its place within a framework that includes the ghosts of the Soviet Union and even the Russian Empire. NATO, long thought by many to be obsolete, reappears amidst the rhetoric of World War. Of course, embodiment is central here too, as it always is. People are suffering and dying. But in each case, embodiment takes its place within a different horizon or background. We saw that his experience does not require disruption and upheaval to be historical. Dilthey reminds us of the historical character of the everyday. And the passage of Carr shows that to the social, political, and embodied aspects of historical experience, we must also add the environmental. Ricoeur was referring to the built environment of urban life and its layered and slower moving development, but the natural environment and our experience of it are no less historical in their own way. We have not mentioned the environmental crisis so far because it doesn't fit easily into the framework of either the ordinary or the extraordinary, as we use those terms, but that's changing. When natural events around us, storms, fires, drought, are experienced against the background of climate change, then natural history becomes human history that impinges directly on our lives. That would be a topic for another paper. Now, I said before that history is often considered something we know or know about rather than something we experience. We learn about it in school. We read about it in books. But there are many things we know and learn about in school, the periodic table, the rings of Saturn, that lack the relation to experience that we find in history. And I would argue that the things we know about history can be meaningful for us because of our capacity to experience history. All the things we've talked about, social cohesion, disruption, the temporality of expectations and disappointments, war, protest, pandemic, are the elements of history that we directly experience before we learn about them in books. Even the most remote stretches of history, far removed from our experience, can be understood by us because of their relation to our experience. Now you might ask, isn't all experience historical? No. If all experience is historical, no experience is historical. Some experience is intensely personal. Some is dual, as in the case of a friendship or a marriage. And some is plural, as in the life of a family, an association, a company, or a professional affiliation, without being properly historical. These latter exhibit the temporal character of historical experience, along with the plurality of group membership, but they fall short, it seems to me, of the historical. We speak of the case history of an individual patient and of natural history that is separate from, even though it can impinge upon, human history. But both are different from historical experience, even though there are places where the one shades into the other. Historical experience, as we intend it here, is experience that is shared with the larger community outside our immediate surroundings and closer associates. One's home country, the modern state, often determines our sense of the historical. But it can be much larger than that. We've seen in the cases of pandemic, protest, and war. It can be smaller, as in the surrounding urban environment. In all cases, it is temporal, encompassing past, present, and envisioned future. And as we've stressed, historical temporality cannot be folded into or reduced to a collection of individual temporalities. It is the shared temporality of a shared historical experience. Now I come to the essence of history, the topic of the seminar. One of my more rebellious colleagues, and you know who you are, Bob, submitted the title, quote, "If history had an essence, it wouldn't be history." I think I know what he means, but I wouldn't go that far. In the previous paragraphs, I've tried to articulate what it is that separates historical from non-historical. It's stipulated that our topic here is not history as such, or in itself, whatever that would mean, but the experience of history. But since, as we've seen, not all experience is historical experience. The attempt to distinguish the historical from the non-historical is somehow involved, and this brings us close to the essence question. History has been called society's memory, making the point that history is social and that it has to do with the past. As we saw, the term history usually refers to past events or our knowledge of past events. And I would want to go further and say that history is society's experience of itself. What I'm calling historical experience certainly belongs to the essence of social existence. And at least part of the essence of history is that it be experienced and not just some anonymous process that occurs over our heads independently of us, which we only learn about afterwards. Our connection to it is direct, and it is this connection that I've tried to describe here as historical experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David, for that fascinating talk. I should add that I had apologies from Bob just before the seminar. Unfortunately, his surgery got moved from 3 o'clock to, only very minor surgery, but got moved from 3 o'clock to midday. in New York, so he couldn't make it. Before I open the floor to questions, I might use my chair's privilege and jump in first. I found your discussion of the nexus, I suppose, between historical experience and the retrospective view of the past, which I suppose is fundamental to the writing of historiography, particularly because it made me think so much of Thucydides, who was both keenly aware of he was a participant in the Peloponnesian War, and he made himself aware of the events of the war, how the Athenians would eventually go on to lose the war. So I think he's fundamental in discovering that nexus between historical experience in the first hand and this retrospective understanding of events in order to find a historical meaning, because you could argue that his history wasn't written just to explain the war itself, but written to explain why the Athenians lost the war, through which he finds a sense of historical meaning and through which his history would be useful, which was his ambition. It was just a point. It made me think of it through your.
Well, yeah, I would even go further. Of course, that distinction is absolutely crucial to the difference, let's say, between experience and, as you say, written history. But I think you can see elements of the retrospective even in experience itself. And I've written about this under the title of the future perfect. That is, we think of what we're doing now in terms of what its outcome will be. Naturally, we don't know the outcome. We may be wrong, but that still constitutes a framework in which a quasi-retrospection, you might call it, is involved in all experience. So that's just to make the point that there's a close connection between the kind of temporal framework that the historian draws on in retrospection and the experiential framework of what I'm calling the experience of history.
Would you, just to ask a quick question then, would you say historiography has the capacity to almost bestow experience? Because I think that was Polybius's point. Polybius wanted his history. He had a practical understanding of the events, but I think he wanted to give that practical understanding to his reader. Do you think there's a form of historiography that can convey experience?
Yes, and I think some historians have done that better than others. I won't comment on Polybius, but I'm trying to think of some examples. I don't know, Frank Ankersmith, who's there, I believe, Frank, has written about, I think along these lines, about Burckhardt and about, the famous Dutch historian whose name I can never pronounce correctly, as historians who are capable of conveying actual experience in the writing of history. But not all historians are good at that. I think some are. Frank is welcome to correct me if I'm misunderstanding him, but he's also written a book called Historical Experience, Sublime Historical Experience.
Yes. Thank you very much. Luke.
Thank you very much for the paper, David. It seems to me, if I'm understanding you, that you're talking about, and your references to people like Dilthey, Kozlek, and so on.
It's a little weak. I don't quite understand. Can you speak more directly into the mic or something? I'm not hearing it.
Maybe I need to turn it. Is that better?
That's better. That's much better. Yes.
Okay, thank you. I'll just try and stay close to my mic. So it seems to me that in your concern with historical experience, you're talking about the structure of the life world, something along these lines, notions of Lebenswelt, what Heidegger might call the ecstasies of Dasein, this kind of thing, and our relationship to great events. And I think you characterize all this very well. I guess I would like to ask how, or I'll ask you to say a little bit more about how that relates to history in the historiographical sense, because it seems to me that what is distinctive about history as a form of knowledge in the sort of retrospective sense is that it represents nobody's experience, and that's the whole point, that you can't live through history in your sense in the way that historians write history, because the whole point is there's some kind of synthesis of what's going on that isn't actually available to any particular individual. So you use the end of the Cold War or the fall of the Berlin Wall, something like this. You know, you can't be on both sides of the Berlin Wall at once as the Berlin Wall is coming down. There are all these different points of view about what's going on, and in the end, the point isn't, although you must account for the different points of view, but the point isn't just to stop there. It's to give some overall explanation of why what was happening fell out as it did. And so that's the unique thing that historical knowledge offers, is in contrast to historical experience. That is absolutely not to say, you're quite right, that the history we live through doesn't make sense as it stands, or that we need historians to make sense of it for us. It has its own self-standing quality. Nevertheless, something like Hegel's Owl of Minerva seems to be operative, that we can only fully make sense, you know, when the dust has settled in the historical way. And so we've just got two fundamentally different kinds of orientation to the past when it comes to the sort of theoretical historical knowledge versus what you're talking about as the history we live through. So I guess I wanted to put that to you. I also think Hayden White is just wrong about historians imposing narrative. So that's one point. The other thing I wanted to ask about, within the life world, within your experience of history, you want to say, well, not all experience is historical. There's personal experience that isn't. But it strikes me that at the historiographical level, you can write a history of private life. You can write a history of individuality. You can write a history of love. You can write a history of marriage. And these things are not historical in your sense, but they do still conform to this general phenomenon of historicity. And this put me in mind of, you know, Wittgenstein's point, there is no private language. Even as a solitary individual, you're still in a sense social. The hermit is still defined by others, even just by not being with others. But so this absolute distinction within the life world that you want to make between what's personal and what's historical, I'm not entirely sure that at the very least it's a bit fuzzy, you know. It's not a very sharp distinction. So just those 2 points.
Yeah, well, on your first point, you seem to be contrasting the sort of, I mean, you still want to go back to the sort of confusion of the present, as opposed to the historians all seeing retrospective view. But of course it's not. I mean, you know, and this is one of the points that Arthur Danto made so well, that the historian too is located in time, and his or her retrospection may be overturned by further future events. So, you know, it's often an example that I give. I mean, somebody who wrote the history of the Cold War in 1980 would probably write a very different history from the person who wrote the history of the Cold War 10 years later or 15 years later. Why? Because so much of the present had changed that the view of the past had to be revised. So that my response to that is, we're all in time. Mm-hmm. We're all in some temporal place, and that's true of historians as well. It's certainly true that they have a different kind of view, and of course I tried to emphasize that as well. On the second point, when I say that not all experience is historical, and when I give the example of the intensely personal or the dual in the case of a marriage or something like that, the experience of a marriage, and I'm saying those are not historical. I'm not saying you can't write a history about those things later. Mm-hmm. But again, I think the historian's perspective on them is very different from the perspective as somebody's living through them. And when I'm talking about experience, I'm talking about what we're living through, whether it's personal or romantic or, in my sense, historical. That's the way I would answer that.
Maybe we're not really disagreeing then.
Yeah.
It kind of sounds like.
Yeah,
Thank
right.
you.
Of course.
Aaron, you're muted.
Yes?
George first, and I think Frank raised his hand. So George, and then Frank, and then Lawrence.
Thank you. And thank you, David, for that talk. I wanted to piggyback off of Aaron's question. I was also thinking of ancient historiography. So in ancient rhetorical theories, there are discussions of how to produce experiential narrative. I know that you're describing the historical here as what we're living through. I'm thinking about how you can convey or record something like that. So the terms ekphrasis and enargia, which I know are familiar to some people, are this kind of ancient rhetorical technique that are defined as literally bringing before the eyes or the ears of the listener the material itself. And Plutarch describes Thucydides' work as actually producing that exactly. He says Thucydides strives for this vividness, for this enargia, and he makes his reader or listener an eyewitness. So I'm wondering, so that is one example of how in ancient historiography, there were rhetorical theories of producing in the reader or in the listener something analogous to what the person who would have apparently experienced the historical moment would have done. Now, obviously, those two are not going to be completely, it's not a one-on-one identification, since the historian is always giving their version of what happened, but their version of the experience of what happened on the ground, but they're striving to produce an experience in the reader that relates to the experience that they perceived or that they are arguing had happened. I'm wondering how this would dovetail with some of the things that you're saying. And I'm also thinking about, as we move away perhaps from narrative forms of historical writing, video, sound, installations, things like that, as means of trying to capture the cacophony or the chaos or something like that of the historical. What do you make of something like that?
Well, I guess my first reaction would be to remind you that I'm not talking about writing history or narrating history, but experiencing history. Now, some historians, it's true, and I mentioned this before, are capable of recreating the experience of the participant, of the agent in history, and some are better at that than others, and some couldn't care. A lot of history isn't about personal experience, it's about other things. But I'm still, I think you're talking about techniques, rhetorical techniques of presenting history to an audience, and that's not what I'm talking about. I guess I'm contrasting what I call the experience of history with the attempt to present history in the way that a historian or the speaker or a videographer would do. That is, when you get to this last point you made, you're really talking about different ways of presenting history, different ways of bringing all these things together in such a way as to present them in a meaningful way to an audience. And you can do that by writing about it, and you can do it by producing videos and interviews and things like that about it as well. But I guess I want to preserve that distinction between the sort of original experience that I'm trying to convey here, and the secondary, no less important, but still secondary presentation of that to some kind of an audience. And that's, first of all, it's related to what I'm talking about. But I guess I want to claim, this may sound sort of old-fashioned, but I'm talking about the original thing, of which these are all secondary manifestations.
That's really helpful. Sorry if I could just ask a quick follow-up. I'm sorry if sorry, Aaron. So to reframe my question, maybe to make it much more explicitly related to what you were saying. So as someone who has, for example, experienced the fall of the Berlin Wall firsthand, and then you're rereading about that, I mean, are those different? What are those different experiences? You know, having lived through something and then re-experiencing that through.
Oh, sure. And of course, one person pointed out that the historian would try to bring in not just one perspective, but many, in looking at it from different points of view. But when I talked about that as an experience of history, I meant precisely that this is something that's experienced not just as something in my life, my personal life, but as something that is a social experience, a shared experience, and it is historical partly because of that. So I can talk about what I saw when I was standing on the street there and watching it happen. But I would say that person, as well as the person sitting in front of his television in New York, you know, both had this sense of history is being made here, and big things are changing. We don't know where they're going. That's sort of what I mean.
Thank you very much.
Frank, did you have a question?
Where's Frank?
Frank, you're muted. If you look down in the bottom left corner, there's a red line through mute.
Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Yes, good.
Yeah.
Frank.
Oh, well, I'd like to thank David very much for his wonderful talk. And I think I'd like to begin with a quote from Alfred Dento, whom you mentioned, in the context that I'm very pleased to hear him mention. And it's a passage from his Transfiguration of the Commonplace. It goes as follows. I now quote Dento. He's speaking about historical periods. So you can speak about history as one period, like the medieval Middle Ages, the Renaissance, etc., and so on. One period following another. And then Dento writes the following about this. He says, it is a period. So if you have a period, it is a period solely from the perspective of the historian, who sees it from without. For those who lived in the period, it would be just the way life was lived.
Yeah.
It is solely a period solely from the perspective of the historian who sees it from without. For those who lived it in the period, it would just be the way life was lived. And asked afterwards what it was like to have lived then, they may answer from the outside, from the historian's perspective. From the inside, there is no answer to be given. It was simply the way things were.
Yeah.
So when the members of a period can give an answer in terms satisfactory to the historian, the period will have exposed its outward surface and in a sense be over as a period. I want to connect it with these notions that you mentioned. Well, in the first place, experience, then the retroactive perspective, and well, then the question of course, of what is the essence of history. And then my question would be, could one not say that in this transition from one period to another, that often goes together with an experience, the French Revolution, or think, for example, of this marvelous story by Hegel on what he called the Das Verderben der griechischen Sittlichkeit, so the decay of Greek ethics, when Socrates came with a new way of thinking about human being, and the Greek state realized itself that he destroyed the Greek state. And so there was immense conflict there. And that's, well, that many people experienced at that time. And so I would say, and that's the first thing I'd like to ask you, is it not the case that experience functions like a kind of gunshot that makes you look into a certain direction? And it is history that makes this happen. You hear this gunshot, perhaps even in the most a real sense when you hear what happens during the French Revolution. You heard the guns, and then you start to ask yourself historical questions. But these are different. You have first the gunshot, and only then it makes sense to ask historical questions. And then you see that this hindsight is presupposed by what happens by historical experiences. The historical experience that is necessary to make this hindsight available to the historian. But only then history can come into being, and which has the implication that history is, again, well, I think that you would have your doubts about, that history is essentially the history of what is the past, of what we have lost of a previous period, and therefore not something that we can be aware of in the time that we are living. And therefore there is a necessary connection between the vision of hindsight, on which Dento insisted so much in his quote, the vision of hindsight, and the coming into being of history. And therefore, history is essentially retroactive. And that gets me to the question of the essence. Should one not therefore conclude from, well, what Dento has suggested here, that the essence of history is in the hindsight? And true, there you're right, we become aware of the hindsight because of the experience of the gunshots. But then, only then, history reveals itself to us.
Yeah, I would say actually, you have to have both. You have to have the retrospection, but you also have to have the gunshot that sets it off. I mean, I'm not, that's a wonderful quote. I'm not familiar with it from Danto, but of course he's insisting on retrospection, as he does already in his philosophy of history. And there's of course so many examples of the sort that he's talking about in periodicity, right? I mean, Renaissance, nobody thought they were living through the Renaissance. It was a name that was made up later. Yeah. Industrial Revolution, it was just, as he says, it's just the way things were. And then afterwards, somebody said, hey, there's an industrial revolution going on. Very different, of course, from the French Revolution, as you point out, because there you had people shooting and storming the Bastille and all this. So clearly, a lot of history, well, in fact, maybe in the way we usually use the word, all history is based on retrospection.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to outline the existence of something that I'm calling historical experience. It is implicitly retrospective, or virtually retrospective, in the sense that, well, you know, in the sense that we look at something, we say, that's historic, even while it's going on. I think what we mean implicitly is that after the fact, that's going to be important, right? It's not just a random event, it's a historical event. So this kind of language is expression is embedded in our language because it maybe borrows, or maybe this is what you mean, it's parasitic on the retrospective point of view of a later historian who will come along and write about it. I just want to revive or rehabilitate maybe the idea of a kind of experience that is implicitly historical, in the sense that it's implicit in my experience of what's going on. And that would be true of the pandemic, the protest, the war. Implicit is the idea that this belongs to history. Now, I could be wrong, of course. We could all be wrong. Maybe this is just a random event that'll disappear and everything will return to normal and people forget it. Mm-hmm. Not the way we experience it. And that's what I'm trying to convey.
May I ask one more question?
Yeah. Well,
Go
ahead.
the series of talks is about the essence of history.
Yeah.
And so my view would be that I can go along with what you have been saying about historical experience, but I wouldn't say it is not the essence. The essence is what it may affect in under certain circumstances. It's quite conceivable thing, even if you look at the past, that you have, terrible events that have been experienced by the people as such, but was not the occasion for an historical awareness. They did not perhaps even occasion historians to write about it.
Mhm.
And it's only there is not. If you look for the essence of history, I would say it is in the idea of hindsight. As soon as people become aware, we live, as Tento said, we live in a later period, and then history comes into being. And that may be thanks to an historical experience, but that is not necessarily so, if only because the experience is a matter of the present, as you said in the beginning of your talk. So if you ask yourself straightforward, with the rifle on with the gun on your breast, so to speak, what is the essence of history? It is in the realization that you belong to a later period and not the experience, not the historical experience.
Well, your answer to the question, the essence of history, is that the essence of history is retrospection, and I can see that, yeah. And to some extent, I'm trying to counter that, because I guess I want to say that all retrospection is looking back at something which originally had its own basis in experience, and maybe destined for retrospection, maybe not, but it still counts as historical. And that's the sense that I'm trying to convey here.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Lawrence, did you still have a question?
No, I think...
sorry, Frank. I was going to say I'm happy to... there are other people who've not participated in the seminar before. I'd like them to ask theirs rather than...
Emily, then.
Thanks so much for your talk. I really, really enjoyed it. And one small point first that reminded me of the historian Herodotus, actually, the point that the historian too is located in time, and the retrospective perspective can be overthrown later. Herodotus arguably, in the later stages of his narrative, sort of encodes the possibility for future readers to take that narrative differently, or at least some distinguished Herodoteans have made this argument. But yeah, so I wanted to throw out there, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Another very recent instance of perhaps an implicitly historical experience that many of us here in the US are having. And I wondered whether it could also fit your category of historical, and whether it perhaps in some ways blurs that distinction that you're drawing between, the more intimate everyday, things happening alone or in twos or in groups. But this recent leak of this judgment overturning Roe strikes me as something that, it seems, I love that, the idea of the gunshot. I think for a number of us in this country, perhaps especially women, perhaps more generally, this has been a bit like a gunshot.
Gunshot, yeah.
And the sense of, the sense of a retrospective happening immediately, like the sense of what this is going to be like down the road. So there's a real sense, I think, of a hinge of history, the sense, this broad idea of, oh my gosh, this is a moment of significant change. We've got a religious minority exerting its rule in a way that will truly shift, very private experiences for people.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, and this type of experience, so it's political, but also it has this extremely intimate and personal perspective. So I would just love to hear your thoughts on that, and whether this would count as another of your moments, like the pandemic,
Yeah.
or, you know.
Yeah, well, yeah, in many ways it does. I mean, I guess my only relation to the personal and the intimate, that in a way, of course, is also true of the pandemic. That is, I could get very sick here, and I better watch out that I don't. And so it's, you know, that aspect of it is very personal and private. But the experience that I'm talking about is the experience of everybody having to respond to this. And I would say the same thing in the case of Roe and its effects, of course, its effects are personal and private for many people, though not everybody. I would say also historical in another sense, and that is, first of all, many of us were not surprised, right? This was coming. And it's been in the works for many years, and it was just a matter of time before it happened. And that doesn't make it any less important, but I guess I would say it belongs on a historical or temporal plane that extends very far back. And that's one of the things that makes it historical. This is an event in the present that is part of a long series of events having to do with women, where their freedom, their autonomy in our society, and so forth. So gunshot, yes, but also a whole historical framework unfolds behind this. And of course, in front of it too. Where is this going to go in the future? But it's a perfect example. I mean, there's no question about that. I just want to...
Yeah, could I just follow up by asking whether, so in the pandemic, so the fact that collectively so many of us have experienced the same thing on a very personal level, does that, in your view, turn those personal experiences into something that you could call historical because it is shared by so many? And I mean that, yeah, that could apply as well to ramifications of the Supreme Court judgment.
Well, yeah, that's right. In other words, what's going on, what I experience, it's not just about me. It's about all of society.
So and that's what makes it count.
Yes, and I would
count under, because I guess I'm going back to that. Sort of getting my head around how these sorts of aspects of life, how they fit under.
Well, yeah, I mean,
why they might not fit as history.
Right. What I said at one point was that not every experience is historical. Some experiences are intensely personal. Okay. Well, what I had in mind is some intensely personal experience that's not shared by anybody except me. Part of my life, part of my internal experience, and so forth. That exists. That's not true of Roe v. Wade. I mean, that's something that's shared in a big way.
And just to ask you just a completely different sort of trivial example. So if someone decides to share with the world, as billions of people are now doing, some fact about the past event of their personal life and to put it up on Facebook, where's that? That's not history. I mean, it's shared with their audience, their friends.
Yeah. It's a question of what it's about. And in those cases you're talking about, I mean, I don't read much Facebook, but.
And perhaps it's the case, it's also the author. So if this was, say, Trump's Facebook account, perhaps, or Twitter account, it can be a historical event because it can, have ramifications that might be recognized as historical.
Well, sure. In that case, sure. If you've got a big, important historical personage who's a bearing his thoughts in this way, that I think certainly belongs to the level of history, of course. It's not just personal. So anyway, I don't know if that helps, but
yeah, thank you. Still thinking.
Helena?
Hi, I'm not sure if there's time. If there's no time, that's okay. I don't have to.
We can make this the last question.
Okay. Thank you very much, David. It was wonderful hearing you talk about these new ways that you're pushing into thinking about experience. What I wouldn't mind you reflecting on is I was thinking about your focus on perception and the way you use the term we. And I'm thinking about inclusivity of when we say this is our, or we think this is a historic experience, who is this we? Who does that include? As there is no single we. And in particular, what I was thinking about is the real value in kind of really changing value now being given to what's called the knowledge gained through lived experience. So this is not necessarily by those who would call themselves historians as such, but I'm thinking particular people in refugee camps, in other kind of minority groups who are kind of choosing to write their own history, even if they don't call it that, but as a way to kind of counteract the huge number of histories and observers who also write historically of their situation, including humanitarian groups and things like that. So it's really kind of, if you could just comment on the valuing of the knowledge gained through lived experience and how that connects to the kind of things that you've been talking about.
Well, I think the kind of, I guess you're talking about memoirs and things like that come from rather unexpected sources, right? But I mean, the move, within history itself, I mean, academic history has been underway for a long time to try to give voice to those who had no voice, or to pay attention to what slave narratives, for example, and things like that, that give expression to an experience that historians can only write about and can't know directly. So I guess that's what you have in mind. Now, there would still be a distinction, I guess, between having the experience, living through these things, and then expressing them to others in the form of diaries or, written expressions of various kinds. But, I certainly agree that what you're talking about would be a valid form of giving expression to what I'm calling the experience of history.
Thanks very much. This is like a much longer conversation, but we're at the end, but I appreciate that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your questions.
Well, it leaves me to say thank you again, David, for a very edifying paper and a really great discussion as well. So thank you, and thank you for everyone thank you to everyone for coming. I look forward to seeing you next week. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.